Scotland is considering introducing masks for secondary school pupils in corridors and communal areas following a series of COVID outbreaks linked to schools. So, should England now be considering the use of face masks for pupils? We're joined by the former Secretary of State for Education, Justine Greening, and the Chair of Public Health at the University of Edinburgh, Professor Devi Sridhar. Good morning to both of you. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. Professor Devi, we'll come to you first in that case. Do you think that it's important then that children are wearing face masks in schools?
Well, I think we need to differentiate between younger kids and older kids, and I think also when exactly they're wearing them in school. So I think now, because we're starting to see increased cases around schools, that it is important to start to think about this in terms of hallways, corridors, where kids are mixing, school transport, and again, for older pupils. It's part of an escalation of measures where, the initial position was not to have masks in schools and to have full-time return. But as transmission increases, as numbers go up, having to consider school by school having that put in place.
And Justine Greening, coming to you then, what do you make of this? Is this something that you would support for older children, wearing them particularly in those transition areas, hallways, in corridors?
I think it is sensible to be considered, as Devi just said, and part of this is about not only taking all the steps we can to reduce the risks so that going back to school is safe for students, it's also about putting confidence back into the education system for parents so that they know that people have thought through all these different issues and are continuing to look at how we can make sure getting back to school is safe. It's absolutely vital now that children and young people get back into education after 6 months out of it. And this is a huge priority, not just for the education system, but I think a lot of parents watching this will know that if you can't get kids back to school, it's hard for them to get back to work. So a lot needs to change in order to make sure that we can get Britain back up and running.
Devi, should we be concerned, though? Scotland schools barely be open just a week or so, and the rest of the schools across England and Wales are due to open. But already we've got a case in Dundee, 27 cases of COVID-19 linked to the school in Dundee, 21 members of staff, 2 pupils and 4 community contacts. That's a concern, isn't it, so soon when schools have only just opened?
Well, yes, schools have been open now 11 days, and in some way this was inevitable. If we look across the world at Germany, now South Korea, we should not underestimate the challenge of reopening schools. Schools are part of communities, and if you have cases in the community, you are more likely to have outbreaks in schools. And I guess one clear lesson is the challenge is not opening schools. As we've seen in the United States, they just open schools. The challenge is keeping them open, because if you keep having clusters and outbreaks, you have to keep shutting them. And that's why really having to make those hard trade-offs over how do you prevent community transmission, how do you stop the number of cases outside schools, is probably the biggest thing you can do to keep schools open.
And Justine Greening, coming to you as former Education Secretary, what do you make of how the government have handled this? Because, schools shut down, they were only open for frontline workers' children or vulnerable children initially. Some children were able to be brought back, but not all. There are those people who are criticising the fact that we couldn't get all children back to schools, but we could get pubs opening, theme parks opening and things. Well, obviously, we had the A-level fiasco over the summer. Now we're looking to get children back. Has there been clear enough guidance around all of this, do you think?
I think everybody understood it was very challenging for ministers in March when schools suddenly had to be shut down. But I think that's several months ago now, and parents and students have a right to expect a plan in place for now reopening schools and getting their education back on track. And I think instead of, if you like, constantly following the debate, and we see today Scotland considering face masks, the UK government in England saying it doesn't think that's necessary. I think the government needs to start leading and shaping the debate instead of constantly looking like it's behind the curve. And I think having a plan for how not only schools can reopen safely, as Devi says, and stay open, but then how we can make sure that young people can catch up this lost education that they've had. We know that it affects less privileged young people far more. Those are the things that now need to be in place if we're going to make sure that we don't continue to see levelling down, which is, of course, what the exams chaos delivered for young people across England.
Devi, can I just be absolutely clear with you then, just so parents know what's coming and prepared for it, that look, you know, schools will open, it'll be up to parents to send their children to school, but we have to accept that these clusters are going to happen. And even in Scotland's case, where you've said before the track and trace system was working well and there was, you know, very low cases, but even when you've got that system in place, we've seen what happened in Dundee, that we've just got to accept that there will be these moments. And the strategy is just to do, you know, all those local areas to do their best to counteract it and to stop coronavirus even entering the schools. But at times that will happen.
Exactly. I mean, the two things I would say to that is, first, we need to keep some kind of broader perspective. This is one school in Dundee, and there are hundreds of schools and thousands of kids who are back at school full time, normally, you know, getting back to their education, their learning, and their mental health. And so we shouldn't let headlines over one school, which of course is concerning, distract from the bigger picture. And the vast majority of schools are actually just doing fine. And the second thing is, the way I try to think about it, and hopefully it's helpful for parents, is first, how do we prevent cases getting into school? That's your front line. Once they get into a school, how do you mitigate it? So what are the measures within schools, such as hand washing, hygiene, staggered start and end times, keeping kids in groups? And third, when a case emerges, how quickly can the system respond? How responsive is it to test and trace? So Dundee, in that way, I think, has been responsive because they got the testing in place to test all contacts, to catch those cases and try to contain that cluster and make sure that it doesn't become a larger problem.
Justine, just a quick word from you before we go. Gavin Williamson has been nominated as MP of the Year. Now, there are those saying that he should lose his job over what happened, particularly concerning A-levels. What do you make of his performance as Education Secretary through this?
I think he's got a job to put confidence back in the system for teachers, parents, and perhaps most importantly, students. I think confidence comes from him having a clear plan and the government having a clear plan on education. I think if I was looking at what the steps are now, they are, frankly, to get a grip, get a plan, and then seize this moment. People voted for change. They want to see a levelled up Britain. We still are yet to see a levelling up strategy from the government. And I think they really need to grab this moment and realise that actually the challenges over COVID, of course, are difficult, but actually it's a moment for change. And the exams chaos and the grading issues mean that we should be looking beyond those narrow academic assessments of young people anyway to their wider potential. Lots of employers are already doing that. These are the sorts of debates, discussions and directions we should be taking in Britain to level up. And that's what I think Boris Johnson's government now needs to really get a grip on. And I think as for Gavin, I'm sure there may well be decisions taken later, but at the moment, those decisions on his future are less important than the decisions on putting in place plans that can guarantee full-time education for every young person in England.